There's a sound that changes everything in certain parts of this country. Not a siren, not a phone notification, just the low drone of a single-engine aircraft cutting through gray sky. And every head in the settlement turns upward, the way you'd turn toward a voice calling your name in a crowd. That plane is not bringing tourists. It's not a charter for some wilderness retreat. It's carrying insulin, a birth certificate, a letter from a daughter who moved to Edmonton 3 years ago. It's carrying the mail, and it comes once a week, sometimes less. Canada likes to present itself as a coherent country, one with universal health care, functioning institutions, equal access to public services. That image holds, more or less, if you stay south of a certain latitude. But push past it, and the image starts to strain. What you find instead are communities that exist at the outer limit of what the Canadian state is willing to reach. Not because the technology doesn't exist to serve them, not because the need isn't there, but because somewhere along the way, someone decided the math didn't work out. This video uses something simple, the frequency of mail delivery, as a way into that larger argument. Because how often the envelope arrives turns out to be a surprisingly accurate measurement of something much harder to quantify: how real a community is to the country that claims to contain it. We're going from 13 to 1, each step further from the center, each step a little harder to explain away. The first thing you notice about Dawson City is that it still has the bones of a boom town. Wide, muddy streets, Victorian storefronts, a wooden boardwalk that creaks under your boots in summer and disappears under snow for most of the year. At its peak, around 1898, at the height of the Klondike Gold Rush, this place held 40,000 people, 40,000, in the Yukon. Less than 1,400 live here now. The mail still comes. That's not the issue. Dawson City is connected enough, recognized enough, historically significant enough that Canada Post maintains a regular route. But there's something about walking those streets in January, when the temperature drops to -40 and the Yukon River is a solid floor of ice, that makes you understand how much of daily life here is defined by distance. The nearest city of any real size is Whitehorse, 535 kilometers south. For basic medical procedures, that's the direction people go. For anything resembling a department store, for anything that isn't already here. Dawson is the entry point into this list because it represents the version of remote Canada that still gets acknowledged. It has a museum, a literary festival, a hotel with a bar that serves a cocktail with a human toe in it, a genuine local tradition that's been running since 1973. The world knows Dawson City exists, but even here, the rhythm of life has already adjusted to absence. You plan further ahead. You order things weeks before you need them. You learn to hold on to what you have. That adjustment, that recalibration of expectation, it only deepens from here. There are islands on the St. Lawrence River that feel like they belong to a different century. Île aux Coudres is one of them. About 90 kilometers northeast of Quebec City, accessible only by ferry. A crossing that takes 20 minutes when the weather allows and becomes impossible when it doesn't. The island has roughly 1,300 residents, families that have been there for generations. A working community, not a tourist novelty. Jacques Cartier anchored here in 1535. He watched the island's shores and named the hazelnut trees growing along the water. 500 years later, the ferry schedule still determines when life moves and when it waits. Mail delivery on Île aux Coudres follows the ferry. When the crossing is cancelled, in storms, in fog, during the worst weeks of winter when ice floes make navigation dangerous, the mail waits on the mainland. A doctor's appointment reminder, a government form with a deadline, an electricity bill. They all sit in a sorting facility across the water, waiting for the river to allow passage. There's something almost absurd about that, if you let yourself think about it. A Canadian citizen, living 30 minutes from a major city by river, whose access to routine correspondence is governed by ice conditions and wind speed. The residents have learned not to think about it that way. You adapt. You build in extra time. You accept that the river decides. But the river isn't a policy. The river isn't a budget decision. The river is neutral. What surrounds it, what does and doesn't exist on that island in terms of services, infrastructure, redundancy, that's where the choices start to show. Stewart sits at the absolute end of a fjord. The Alaskan border is, technically, the next town over. Hyder, Alaska, population under 100, which shares its school with Stewart because there aren't enough children on either side to sustain a separate one. The two communities function as a single organism split across an international boundary. Stewart's connection to the rest of British Columbia is Highway 37A. One road, 265 kilometers to the nearest junction with the main highway network. And in winter, that road can close. Avalanche risk. Ice. Conditions that make driving not merely difficult, but actively fatal. The mail comes by truck along that road. When the road closes, for a day, for a week, in extreme winters for longer, the mail stops too. Stewart is not, technically, an isolated community. It has roads. It has a small but functioning infrastructure. But isolations don't always announce themselves cleanly. Sometimes they're conditional. Sometimes what looks like connection is actually just one thin thread. And the thread has a season. About 350 people live in Stewart now. The town's population peaked at several thousand during the silver and gold mining years. The mine that sustained it for decades, the Grand Duke mine, is closed. What remains is a community that chose to stay at the end of a road that a few times a year forgets they're there. Faro was built for a specific purpose, to house the workers of the Anvil mine, one of the largest open-pit lead zinc operations in the world at its peak. The company town went up fast in the late 1960s. Housing, schools, a recreation center, a curling rink. At its peak, Faro had around 1,500 residents, full infrastructure, a functioning economy built entirely around one mountain being hollowed out. The mine closed in 1998. Not the first time. It had shut and reopened before, but this closure held. And what it left behind is one of the more quietly haunting things in the Yukon. An entire town, still largely standing, built at scale for a population that no longer exists. Fewer than 300 people live in Faro now. The infrastructure remains, the streets, the recreation center, the water treatment system, maintained for a fraction of the population it was designed to serve. The mail comes weekly. There are people here who want it, who receive it, whose lives are rooted in this specific valley for reasons that have nothing to do with the mine anymore. But Faro is also a case study in what happens when the reason for a place disappears and the place remains anyway. The town didn't leave with the workers. It stayed. And now it exists in a kind of suspended state, too small to justify its infrastructure, too persistent to be simply written off. What do you do with a town that outlasted its own reason for being? That's not a rhetorical question. The Yukon government has been trying to answer it for 25 years. The Ottawa-Piscat River empties into James Bay on Ontario's remote western coast. The community that lives there, Ottawa-Piscat First Nation, has about 2,000 members. No road connects it to the provincial highway system year-round. In winter, an ice road forms over the muskeg and frozen lakes, and for a few months, trucks can bring in bulk supplies. In every other season, the only way in or out is by air. The mail arrives by plane, weekly, roughly, depending on whether the chartered flight has room, depending on a scheduling logic that isn't really designed around the people at the receiving end. Ottawa-Piscat has declared multiple states of emergency in recent decades. Housing crises, suicide crises, contaminated water, inadequate schools. It appeared in national headlines in 2011 and again in 2016, briefly becoming a name that Canadians outside the North knew, and then, as these things go, fading back into the distance from which it had momentarily emerged. What's easy to miss in those news cycles is that none of what was reported came as a surprise to anyone who lives there. The conditions being described, the overcrowded housing, the mold, the mental health crisis, weren't sudden. They had been building for decades. They had been reported to government bodies, documented in internal reviews, acknowledged in reports that sat on desks in Ottawa and Queen's Park and went nowhere. The mail kept coming. One more plane landing on a strip of compacted gravel. One more sack of envelopes dropped at a community office. The rest of what should have come still hasn't. You won't find Gambler First Nation mentioned in most conversations about Canada's remote communities. It's not famous for any crisis. It hasn't been in the national news. It's just small, fewer than 150 members. And it sits in the parkland region of western Manitoba in a way that makes it simultaneously close to larger centers and genuinely difficult to reach with any regularity. In winter, access improves. The ice roads connect what the gravel roads don't. In summer, a dirt track and eventually a gravel approach bring you in. Neither option is reliable in the way that, say, a paved highway is reliable. Neither option is immune to seasonal disruption. The mail's arrival schedule is determined by nature more than by institution. That's a strange thing when you stop to think about it. Every other community in southern Manitoba gets mail according to Canada Post's schedule. Gambler gets mail according to weather. That asymmetry, so quiet, so persistent, is the thing that this list keeps returning to. The rules are the same on paper. The experience is not. La Loche is about 600 kilometers north of Saskatoon. The highway connecting it to the provincial grid, Highway 155, was paved only in 2012. For decades before that, the road was gravel. Washboard rough in summer, treacherous in shoulder seasons, closed in the worst winter conditions. The mail came along that unpaved road. Before the highway, before the upgrade, before anyone in the South felt the political pressure to fix it. The mail still came, because that's what you do. You route around the absence. In January 2016, La Loche became for a moment a name the country knew. A mass shooting at a local high school, 4 people killed, 7 wounded. The community, already dealing with persistent poverty, inadequate mental health infrastructure, and the particular weight of geographic isolation, absorbed something that would have strained any community regardless of where it sat. What followed was a familiar pattern: national grief, promises of support, task forces, funding announcements, and then, gradually, the attention moved on. La Loche didn't. The highway is paved now. The mail arrives more reliably than it used to. But a paved road and regular correspondence don't close the gap that decades of non-investment opens. They don't replace the hospital La Loche doesn't have, the mental health services that still require flying someone out, the infrastructure that should have been built long before the road got fixed. Sometimes the improvement itself becomes the excuse to stop looking. Population, roughly 200. Latitude, 74 degrees north. Average annual temperature, minus 16 degrees Celsius. Daylight in December, none. Resolute Bay is one of the northernmost permanent settlements in the Western Hemisphere. It exists, improbably, on Cornwallis Island in the Qikiqtaaluk region of Nunavut, an island most people couldn't place on a map, in a territory most Canadians couldn't describe in detail. The community's origins are complicated in a way that hasn't fully been reckoned with. In the early 1950s, the Canadian government relocated Inuit families from Inukjuak in northern Quebec to Resolute and nearby Grise Fjord. The official reason was resource management and sovereignty assertion. Canada needed demonstrable human presence in the high Arctic to reinforce territorial claims. The actual cost was paid by the families who were moved, who found themselves in an environment far more extreme than anything they'd known, with inadequate supplies, broken promises of return, and almost no support. The Government of Canada eventually acknowledged this as a wrong, formally, in 2010. Mail reaches Resolute Bay by air, when the aircraft can land, which is not always. Storms can ground flights for days. Fog can make the approach impossible. The logistics of supplying any community at 74 degrees north involve a tolerance for interruption that Southern Canadians never have to develop. What strikes you most about Resolute is not its extremity. It's the persistence. People live there. They have lived there. They have made that island, that cold, that darkness, into something like home. In some cases because they were brought there against their will and stayed because there was nowhere obvious to return to. The mail arrives when it can, as it always has. Pikangikum is accessible by winter road for a few months each year. For the rest of the year, float plane or nothing. The community of roughly 2,500 people sits on the shores of Pikangikum Lake in northwestern Ontario, 100 kilometers north of Red Lake, which is itself not a major center by any meaningful measure. The conditions in Pikangikum have been documented extensively. Water quality issues, chronic housing shortage, high rates of youth suicide that led the community to be described, in a 2011 coroner's inquest, as facing a mental health crisis of uncommon severity. An electrical system so overloaded that fire risk became a constant reality. A garbage dump that caught fire and burned for years, its smoke drifting over homes. All of this was documented, reviewed, reported to provincial and federal bodies. And yet, in 2025, many of the same structural conditions persist, not because no one knows, but because knowing and acting in the Canadian context of Northern First Nations communities have proven to be two different things separated by a gap that no report has successfully bridged. The mail comes weekly, by plane, when the plane comes. It's not the most important thing that's missing, but it stands in for everything else that arrives with that same qualified irregularity: health services, school resources, government presence, basic accountability, weekly, when possible, if the weather holds, if the budget allows. Colville Lake, Bechoko in the Dean language, sits about 70 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle, in the Northwest Territories. Population, around 150. Founded more than a century ago as a trading and mission post, the community has existed continuously for generations. There is no road to Colville Lake. The winter road that connects it to the main highway system operates for roughly 3 months of the year, when ice and frozen ground can support vehicle traffic. For the other 9 months, access is exclusively by chartered aircraft. Mail arrives by air. The frequency depends on the charter schedule, which depends on demand, weather, and the operational priorities of the airline serving the route. In practice, this means weekly delivery is the goal, and a goal that isn't always met. What's interesting about Colville Lake, if that's the right word, is that it doesn't fit the profile of a place that got left behind. It was never an industrial town that emptied out. It was never a boom and bust settlement. It's a community that was always small, always northern, always Dean, and which the Canadian state has, across a century of its existence, mostly treated as a logistical anomaly rather than a legitimate place that deserves consistent infrastructure. The community has a school, a nursing station, a small store. It functions. But the gap between what it has and what a community of comparable size in southern Canada would be guaranteed, that gap is not measured in kilometers, it's measured in decisions. Banks Island is the westernmost island in the Canadian Arctic archipelago. It's roughly the size of Iceland. Its entire human population lives in one settlement, Sax Harbor, on the southwestern coast. About 100 people. One community. One island. The Inuvialuit have lived on Banks Island seasonally for centuries, following muskox and peary caribou. Sax Harbor as a permanent settlement developed in the mid-20th century when families chose to stay year-round. It is, in the most literal sense, the only place on an island the size of a European country. Mail arrives by scheduled air service, when the service operates, which is not daily and not always weekly. In practice, residents receive mail when the plane comes, and the plane comes when conditions allow, and when the economics of the route make it viable. Banks Island is not on the way to anywhere. Every flight is a dedicated trip to the end of a very long line. What Sax Harbor has that many communities on this list don't is a particular kind of clarity. There's no ambiguity about the isolation. It's physical, obvious, measurable. The island is the island. The sea is the sea. You either have access or you don't, and you know it. What's harder to see, from a distance, is what that isolation has preserved. A relationship to the land that exists almost nowhere else in North America. A community small enough that everyone's story is known, that no one disappears into anonymity. A place where the phrase sense of place means something exact and unmistakable. But preservation isn't the same as choice. And the families of Sachs Harbor didn't select their geographic situation because it would keep culture intact. They stayed because they had roots there, because the land is theirs in a way that precedes every map, every postal code, every government designation. The mail comes once a week, sometimes less. The Beaufort Sea doesn't negotiate. On February 3, 1947, a weather station in Snag, Yukon, recorded the lowest temperature ever measured in continental North America, minus 63 degrees Celsius. The air was so cold that day that breath didn't produce steam. It crackled audibly, freezing before it had time to become vapor. Sound carried in unusual ways. The few people present said that the cold had a quality to it that wasn't simply discomfort, but something closer to a kind of silence that the world rarely produces. Snag was a small airstrip settlement, never more than a handful of buildings, maintained during and after the Second World War as part of a network of emergency landing sites along the Northwest Highway system. At its height, it housed the weather station staff, a maintenance crew, and almost no one else. The weather station closed. The maintenance crew left. The building stayed, for a while, and then began the slow process of returning to the permafrost. What makes Snag different from a simple ghost town is that the mail stopped before the people did. The postal route was withdrawn, quietly, administratively, without ceremony, while a handful of people were still technically present. It wasn't that the community ceased to exist and the mail followed. The mail left, and the remaining presence became, in the system's accounting, no longer worth serving. That sequence matters. The withdrawal of a postal route is not a passive act. It's a declaration. It says, "We have assessed the cost of reaching you, and we have decided you are not worth the reach." Snag is empty now. The temperature record still stands. There is a community on this list that has no name in any public record. It appears in internal Canada, post-routing documents, under a reference code, not a name, as a waypoint on a multi-stop air route serving the central Canadian subarctic. The route exists because people live there. The people are predominantly Indigenous families who have occupied this land for generations. The community has a school of a kind, a shared gathering structure, satellite communications that function intermittently. It does not have a postal code. Canada Post assigns postal codes to addresses. Addresses require official recognition by the relevant municipal or territorial authority. This community, for reasons that involve a combination of bureaucratic jurisdiction, unresolved land claims, and what amounts to administrative indifference, has never been formally recognized as an addressable location. It exists. The routing exists. The mail arrives every 2 weeks via a small aircraft that makes 3 other stops along the way. But officially, in the ledger of Canadian addresses, this place is not there. Residents who need to receive government correspondence, tax documents, healthcare cards, benefit statements, use a post office box registered in the nearest recognized community, which is itself small and remote. Their official address is somewhere they don't live, for a system that won't acknowledge where they do. There's a word for this, though it rarely gets used in the context of Canadian governance. The word is erasure, not violent erasure, not dramatic erasure. The quiet bureaucratic kind. The kind that happens when a community falls between the categories, when nobody with the authority to assign a postal code ever decides it's worth the paperwork. Mail arrives there every 14 days, weather permitting, route permitting, priorities permitting. The families have been there longer than the postal system has existed. The postal system still hasn't found a way to officially acknowledge that. There's a word Canadians use a lot when they talk about this country: vast. Vast landscape, vast distances, vast wilderness. And it's true, Canada is enormous, and some of what looks like neglect is genuinely the friction of geography. But geography doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain why some remote communities have hospitals, and others have nursing stations that close on weekends. It doesn't explain why some ice road communities were brought onto the all-season road network decades ago, while others are still waiting. And it doesn't explain why a community of families who have lived in the same place for generations can exist without a postal code. The decisions that create these gaps, the funding formulas, the infrastructure priorities, the bureaucratic thresholds, Those aren't made by the landscape. They're made by people, in offices, in cities where the mail arrives every morning, reliably, without anyone having to wonder whether the weather will cooperate. Somewhere north of where this video ends, a small aircraft is following a route that no map shows to any general public. It's carrying envelopes, packages, a few government forms with deadlines that won't be met by the time they arrive. It will land on a strip of compressed gravel or ice and leave the mail with whoever comes to collect it. Then it will rise again into that white sky and continue to the next stop. And the community will wait 2 more weeks.